We're preparing to enter into the offering of first fruits in a couple of weeks, less than a couple of weeks, on April 3rd, technically the evening of April 2nd, but it will continue into April 3rd will be the bulk of that day. So I've done a few videos talking about how to know when the offering of first fruits is. There are a lot of arguments online about when the offering of first fruits is, but the reason people are arguing about this is because they are basing the offering of first fruits on the Gregorian calendar, and you can't do that. You have to base God's holy days on his own calendar, which is set in reference to the moon. So when I tell you that the offering of first fruits is either going to be on the 22nd or the 23rd of God's month, whatever month that is, if it's the month of Nisan, it'll be the 22nd because that's the day after the Sabbath. In Nisan, the Sabbaths get kind of thrown off just by a day. On a lunar calendar, you're going to have the first day of the month, the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th are all going to be Sabbaths. The 7-day Sabbaths are only going to be the 8th, the 15th, the 22nd, and the 29th. Because God established that Passover was to be observed a Sabbath on the 15th and a Sabbath on the 21st, the 22nd of Nisan is no longer a 7-day Sabbath because the 21st is a Sabbath. So the Sabbaths get thrown off a little bit. The same thing happens in the month in which Pentecost occurs, which can be variable because Pentecost is not a month or date-specific holy day. It's a season-specific holy day. But in the month when Pentecost occurs, the Sabbaths are going to get thrown off by a day because Pentecost ends up being the day after the Sabbath, but Pentecost is also a Sabbath. I know that's very confusing. It's not something I'm going to go through in this video because this is not about discerning God's calendar. I've done many videos on that. So the reason people are arguing about this is because we know that the offering of first fruits in Leviticus 23 says, when you enter the land, I'm going to give you, this is what you're going to do. You're going to reap the harvest, but you're not going to eat any of it until you bring a sheaf of the wave offering to the priest to wave it on your behalf so that you will be accepted, or your offering will be accepted. What is the criteria when you enter the land? Well, they entered the land camping during and observing the Passover on the last day of the Passover, which is the 21st. The day after the last day of the Passover, they reaped, they ate the food from the land, and they observed the first offering of first fruits. So we know that it happened on the 22nd. So that's not complicated, is it? If the 22nd is set in reference to the moon, so we know that the first is the new moon, which is the crescent, not what science is calling the new moon, but it is when the crescent appears. Then we know the next Sabbath, 8 days later, on the 8th, is going to be a first quarter moon. The 15th is going to be a full moon. The 22nd is going to be a last quarter moon. And the 29th is going to be a dark moon, what science is calling the new moon. Okay, so we know that every 22nd of God's month during the last quarter moon or the 23rd. So if it lands in the month of Nisan, it's going to be the 22nd. Any other month, it's going to be the 23rd. So all you have to do is set that in reference to the barley harvest season, which occurs at the end of March, early April. And so you just look for, well, where's the last quarter moon? At that point, you should be observing God's calendar. And so you're looking for the 22nd or the 23rd, depending on what month you're in. 22nd if you're in Nisan, also called Abib or Aviv. So if that's the month you're in, you'll be observing on the 22nd. Any other of the 11 months will be the 23rd of the month. This particular month, it's going to end up in the second month on God's calendar, the month of Ziv, Z-I-V. If you're just learning God's calendar, I hope that you won't get too discouraged because it really is not that complicated. The only thing that's made it complicated is that we're so accustomed to a Roman calendar. And so we're having to learn new paradigms by which to understand a week, by which to understand a month, etc. Weeks in God's calendar are not consecutive 7 days. You have a break between, in a 30-day month where the new moon, the crescent, is beginning that month. A week is going to be defined as 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. 6 days of work, 1 day of rest. And you have 4 of those in a month, but you have 30 days. And 30 days are not evenly divisible by 7. So there are going to be those 2 other days that have to be accounted for. Well, the first The first day in God's month is a Sabbath. It's not a 7-day week Sabbath. It is a Sabbath because it's a new moon, because it's the first day of the month. The next 6 days are going to be work days, then a 7th day of rest, 6 days of work, 7th day of rest, 6 days of work, 7th day of rest, 6 days of work, 7th day of rest. So you're going to have 4 weeks. And then that's going to bring you to the 29th of the month, usually. Sometimes it gets thrown off. So like with Pentecost, you have Pentecost falling on the 16th. Well, the 15th is a 7-day Sabbath. Now you have 2 Sabbaths back to back because Pentecost is a Sabbath. And so that pushes forward the 7-day Sabbaths so that you'll actually have the Sabbath for that particular month. You're going to have the Sabbath on the 30th, and then you'll have another Sabbath on the 1st. It isn't that complicated. Once you get the hang of it, once you sit down and map it out and you follow those instructions, you're going to understand. And it's God's will for you to understand, so he'll make it happen. Okay, so I don't know why I started talking about the calendar necessarily. Oh, because we wanted to establish when the offering of first fruits is. So because people keep saying, well, it's on this date, this is when, can you see that this barley is ready, and it's, such and such date on the Gregorian calendar. Or they might say, it's such and such date in Aviv, and they're not even going on the right calendar. They're going off of the Reformed Judaism calendar that prostituted itself to Rome. And so there's a lot of confusion around being able to understand being able to understand when we're supposed to observe these appointed times. God told us he was going to do that in the Bible because of disobedience, that he was going to remove those appointed times. And then he reinstates them because he tells us that we're observing them in the end times. And so that's what he's doing right now. And it's a very exciting thing. So here's another thing that I want to explain to you. In a seasonal calendar and in the Gregorian calendar, you have seasons lining up with particular months. You don't have that on God's calendar. That's why people are getting tripped up and they keep saying, it's in Aviv or Nisan. And then they argue what date it is in Aviv. That's not true because God's calendar has 30 days in a month, 360 days in a year, 1,260 days in 3.5 years, 150 days in 5 months, as indicated in Genesis. So we know for certain that there are 30 days in God's months. It's not going to be variable between 29 and 30 days because the math doesn't add up. But here's the thing. On a lunar calendar, we know that there are 29.5 24-hour days from new moon to new moon, from what science is calling the new moon, the dark moon. So there is a 29.5 day cycle of the moon based on 24-hour days. So technically, on God's calendar, there are 354 24-hour days. However, God is defining them as 360 days because you have to understand that when the crescent shows up, that begins a new day. It kicks out the old and it begins the new. It begins a new day and it begins a new month. So you could have a day in which the 30th of the month, and this is what happens on these days that science is calling a 29-day month, which is you have to understand they're reconciling it some way, right? If they're telling us that there's 29.5 days in a lunar cycle, and then they're saying, well, there's 30 days in one lunar month and 29 days in another, they're rounding. Somewhere there, they're rounding. But that's not what God said. He didn't say round up a day. He said the new moon is going to begin the new month, and therefore it would begin the new day. So in these months where science is calling a lunar month a 29-day month, what is actually happening is that the 30th day is beginning in the evening and then until morning, and then the crescent is appearing. So you can see, for example, there's a website that I use. It's called, hang on one sec, paulcarlisle.net/mooncalendar/. Okay, so you can see on those particular months where science is calling it a 29-day month, the crescent moon the illumination might be at like 0.3 or 0.2 or something like that. So it's not going to be visible. But as the night goes on and in the morning, it's going to be visible. So you have the 30th day beginning in the night and then till morning. And this shouldn't be a problem for you because in Genesis it says there was evening and morning the first day. And then in morning, when that crescent shows up, now you've begun a new day. You've begun a new day and you've begun a new month. So what we're calling a 24-hour day could actually have the 30th that is continuing from the previous night into the morning, then the first day of the month, which is starting from the morning, and then the second day of the month, which is starting in the evening. I know that gets really wonky, but listen, this is how God wants us to live. He wants us hanging on what he has established. He's not a fan of this predictability that is man-made. For our own comfort, he wants us to hang on what he has established. And having a calendar like this really does make us hang on what he has established. We're going to be looking for it. We're going to be basing our lives around what he's doing, rather than making him fit into what we're doing. Okay, so that's why there's all of this argument around when the offering of first fruits is, but we know when it is. It's either going to be the 22nd in the month of Nisan, or it's going to be the 23rd. During that season, and I hate to go by the Gregorian calendar, but in the absence of us, all working the land, we don't have the ability to know when that barley season is, but we do know that it occurs at the end of March, early April. And we also know that when the Israelites ate the produce of the land was the day after the Sabbath on the offering of first fruits, because they would not have eaten anything from the land until they brought the sheaf of the wave offering to the priest. We also know that it was the 22nd because it was the day after the Passover. For those who think that the day after the Passover is the 15th, that's a Sabbath. And the offering of first fruits has to occur after, the day after the Sabbath, because you can't reap on the Sabbath. So the Passover is the entire period of the 14th until the 21st, the day when you eat the lamb and the unleavened bread. If you are confused about that, please go to Luke 22, verse 1, and that should clear it up for you. Now, I want to do a study of crossing the Jordan, the significance of crossing the Jordan. I did a study previously on entering the land, and now I want to do a study on crossing the Jordan, all the references that God made of crossing the Jordan, when you cross the Jordan. I want to fully understand the significance of what it means to cross the Jordan and to enter the land that God has promised. Numbers 32. The Reubenites and the Gadites, who had very large herds and flocks, saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were suitable for livestock. So they came to Moses and Eleazar the priest and to the leaders of the community and said, Ataroth, Dibon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Elileh, Sebam, Nebo, and beyond. The land the Lord subdued before the people of Israel are suitable for livestock, and your servants have livestock. If we found favor in your eyes, they said, let this land be given to your servants as our possession. Do not make us cross the Jordan. Do you understand this feeling? Because we often feel very detached from the people in the Bible. But look, they have a life there. The blessings that God is going to give us are not always convenient to obtain. There's a lot of suffering. In fact, the majority of the time, if not all the time, they are not convenient. They're not just handed to us on a silver platter. There's suffering that we have to endure, and there's faith. And a lot of times, that faith is produced by suffering, is produced by holding out and continuing to lean in and believe, even though everyone's telling you you're crazy. Or you might be telling you you're crazy. You might be looking at situations and saying, this is impossible. How's God going to do this? Is he really? Moses said to the Gadites and Reubenites, should your fellow Israelites go to war while you sit here? Why do you discourage the Israelites from crossing over into the land the Lord has given them? This is what your fathers did when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to look over the land. After they went up to the valley of Eshcol and viewed the land, they discouraged the Israelites from entering the land the Lord had given them. The Lord's anger was aroused that day, and he swore this oath. Because you have not followed me wholeheartedly, not one of you who were 20 years old or more when they came up out of Egypt will see the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Not one, except Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and the Kenizzite, and Joshua, son of Nun, for they followed the Lord wholeheartedly. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years, until the whole generation of those who had done evil in his sight was gone. And here you are, a brood of sinners, standing in the place of your fathers and making the Lord even more angry with Israel. If you turn away from following him, he will again leave all this people in the wilderness, and you will be the cause of their destruction. Then they came up to him and said, we would like to build pens here for our livestock and cities for our women and children, but we will arm ourselves for battle and go ahead of the Israelites until we have brought them to their place. Meanwhile, our women and our children will live in fortified cities for protection from the inhabitants of the land. We will not return to our homes until each of the Israelites has received their inheritance. We will not receive any inheritance with them on the other side of the Jordan, because our inheritance has come to us on the east side of the Jordan." Then Moses said to them, "If you will do this, if you will arm yourselves before the Lord for battle, and if all of you who are armed cross over the Jordan before the Lord until he has driven his enemies out before him, then when the land is subdued before the Lord, you may return and be free from your obligation to the Lord and to Israel, and this land will be your possession before the Lord. But if you fail to do this, you will be sinning against the Lord, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Build cities for your women and children and pens for your for your flocks, but do what you have promised." The Gadites and the Reubenites said to Moses, "We, your servants, will do as the Lord commands. Our children and wives, our flocks and herds, will remain here in the cities of Gilead, but your servants, every man who is armed for battle, will cross over to fight before the Lord, just as our Lord says." Then Moses gave orders about them to Eleazar the priest and Joshua son of Nun, and to the family heads of the Israelite tribes. He said to them, "If the Gadites and Reubenites, every man armed for battle, cross over the Jordan with you before the Lord, when the land is subdued before you, you must give them the land of Gilead as their possession. But if they do not cross over with you armed, they must accept their possession with you in Canaan." The Gadites and the Reubenites answered, "Your servants will do what the Lord has said. We will cross over before the Lord in Canaan armed, but the property we inherit will be on this side of the Jordan." Then Moses gave to the Gadites, the Reubenites, and the half-tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph, the king of Sihon, king of the Amorites, and the kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, the whole land with its cities and territories around them. The Gadites built up Dibon, Adaroth, Aroer, Etroth, Shophon, Jazer, Jogbehah, Beth Nimrah, and Beth Haran as fortified cities, and built pens for their flocks. And the Reubenites rebuilt Heshbon, Elealeh, and Kiriathaim, as well as Nebo and Baal Meon. These names were changed, and Sibmah. They gave names to the cities they rebuilt. The descendants of Machir, son of Manasseh, went to Gilead, captured it, and drove out the Amorites who were there. So Moses gave Gilead to the Machirites, the descendants of Manasseh, and they settled there. Jair, a descendant of Manasseh, captured their settlements and called them Havoth Jair. And Noba captured Kenath and its surrounding settlements and called it Noba after himself. The morals that I get out of this story are: stay with the Lord's plans. Don't get comfortable where you're at. Follow what you know he knows is good. And don't do things out of fear. You see that even though the Reubenites and Gadites ended up staying in that land, they still went forward. They armed themselves for battle. They didn't turn back. And they ended up asking permission to be able to have that land. But it wasn't granted to them on the basis of them not going and fighting the battle. They still had to pick up their cross. They still had to do all of this. And they still had to ask for permission. I personally think it's extremely important, and have learned that it's extremely important to just stay with what the Lord wants to do. Even if I think I've heard a particular thing, or I think something's going to go a particular way, I always end up having to work my heart into, okay, I thought it was going to go like this, but I know that you know what's good. I know that I do not know what is required in order for me to be saved, and that your plans are good for me, and that you know what's good. So I'm going to rend my heart at the end of the day to whatever it is that you're doing. I also take very seriously this promise that Moses is giving. And here you are, a brood of sinners, standing in the place of your fathers and making the Lord even more angry with Israel. Listen to the promise. If you turn away from following him, he will again leave this people in the wilderness, and you will be the cause of their destruction. We have to take that seriously. We can't be leading people astray. We can't be shaking people up and causing fear. We have to deal with our own stuff. We got to bring it back to God and sort through it with him. This includes, by the way, I've had to do this as well, because my daughter and I have been, a big support to one another. I mean, we've been all each other has had most of our lives, but we've both had to really, God has called each of us in individually, particularly as we're going through certain things, to not be a stumbling block to one another, to not use each other in the place of God for support, for venting our frustration, or venting or even faith building. It's one thing to share one another's testimony, and here's what God is telling me, and here's what he's building in me, and here's how I'm standing right now. This is what's helping me. It's a whole other thing. It can cross over into the territory of encouraging one another in an idolatrous way. It can also cross over into the territory of discouraging each other when we're having trouble standing in that faith. Or we hear that the other is having trouble standing in their faith, and then we start to go, oh, should I be concerned? If they're concerned, then should I be concerned? And then you start spinning out on that. We need to relate with each other correctly, not presenting stumbling blocks for idolatry, but making sure that God is the one who is regulating the tone of our mood and our faith. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and then I'll go ahead and read the next context in the next video. Please discern this message with God. If there's another message that you get from this, please write it down in the comments section so that all of us can benefit. We can have a dialogue around this. The last thing actually that occurs to me about this is, a lot of times we can get really kind of comfortable, even though this life really isn't comfortable. So I'm not talking about necessarily like entirely the way that the world becomes comfortable or counterfeit Christianity, but we can get kind of complacent, might be the better word, and think, oh, I just want to kind of stay here. I don't want to go where you're taking me. And we have no idea where he's about to take us. We have no idea how beautiful that's going to be, how wonderful it's going to be. Why would we want to sacrifice that because of fear or because of complacency? So we really need to check our hearts on that and make sure that we're trusting the plans that the Lord has. Please discern with God.